might as well go ahead and get started with a couple of things while we work out the last little technical issues here. Do people over in the cafe know this is going on?
I think Anne's on it. I might go over there.
Okay, great. Well, the first thing I wanted to, I guess since we have a small group here, maybe we can just go around and very quickly say who we are, where we're coming from, maybe a little bit about what groups we're affiliated with. So we can just start over here.
Hey, I'm Ty, and I'm with Occupy Tampa.
Okay.
Robert, Occupy Naples, and I brought a bunch of graphic posters up for handing out to demonstrators. I'm a school teacher and have to get back by Monday.
I'm Laura, I'm from Naples and Coke.
Alan Coker, I'm from Jeff Hensarling, 5th Congressional District in Texas, and I'm probably the only member of the Local Issues Party for low-income people. Our trademark is Rolling Stone Fled.
What city is that?
Eustis, Texas, it's 60 miles east of Dallas, 900 people.
Okay, sir.
I'm Dolores Parra. I'm interested in following progressives.
Mario Parra, we're from Mountain Lakes.
My name is Philip Bloom. I'm from here. And the group I'm with is Tampa Free School.
We're just doing brief, short introductions.
Yeah, and what have I stumbled into?
This is a workshop on media strategy, particularly focused on mass media, dealing with reporters for activists.
Okay, well, I'll just listen for minutes. I'm actually from the media.
Oh,
Yeah,
well,
no,
hopefully.
I'm not that kind of media. I'm from Pacifica Radio.
Okay, well, nonetheless, you might be able to offer us some perspectives.
Probably only have a few minutes, but yeah. Well, Pacifica's, I don't know if people are familiar with it, but it's not the, we're not CNN or Fox.
Right. Yeah, and so that would be, that's an important qualification of what I'll be talking about today is that this, you know, I'm just going to stick to an hour or so, and for reasons of time, I'm just going to be focused on what I call mass media in the description of what we're talking about here. So, and that for me includes primarily newspapers, television, maybe radio, and generally commercial media, corporate-owned media, stuff that's on a large scale, not necessarily national. It does include local outlets, but definitely stuff that's commercial and corporate. Everybody come on in. And we can do it. Yeah. Do we want to do that real quick? Here, we're just going to try and move all the tables this way. So we can open up the door a little bit.
Shame, huh?
Yep, I did. It was necessary. This thing is not starting up. I don't know what happened. But it would seem I have an issue and it doesn't. That means I can't actually get to my power. So I'm gonna leave this going. Maybe I'll eventually resolve this issue. Yeah, I've already tried that twice. Yeah, I unplugged the thing.
I can get from $10.
Yeah, it's getting the login. So I don't know. We'll wing it, but we'll be okay. So it looks like we might be without my PowerPoint, but that's not a game breaker. So I wanted to start today just to sort of establish the kind of perspective that most of us are probably coming from. With a quick show of hands, I just described what I'm calling the mass media, the commercial media. How many people in here would describe the mass media defined that way as corrupt? Raise your hand if you feel like that's an accurate characterization.
Define corrupt?
Well, you define corrupt. Is that a word that would apply to your
Anything you get reaching
the mass media being like commercial, corporate owned, large scale, things like CNN, like your local ABC. So a few people.
I don't know if you can say corrupt, but I think that you have to admit and see that the majority of them are looking after their own self-interest primarily.
Right.
And almost exclusively, and once they get into a position where they're people with money and power, even if they start well.
So that's one way of understanding, and I mean corrupt. I would say just in the sense that most people or many people coming from the left, from a progressive perspective, no longer feel that the media represents the interests of the people at large. We talk about the media being the fourth estate, of having a role of reflecting back on society and sending important messages to institutions like government about the state of society and helping the government regulate and helping the people regulate the government. And so when we talk about the current failures of media, what I think many of us are thinking about is that the media is no longer playing that role of representing the interests of people, sort of average people, everyday people. And we've just heard one quick gloss on why that might be, that the media is acting in its own self-interest, and particularly when you're talking about commercial media, the self-interest comes from what? Money from advertising, money from the sense that they're owned by powerful people or big corporations, and that those interests come to dominate over an idealized role of the media as something that provides information about how we can make our country or the world a better place. So that's one of the elements of, and I think people were watching us struggle with the computers here, and so I don't have a PowerPoint, unfortunately, so you're going to maybe have to take some notes, but that's a part of what's called the propaganda model, an understanding of the media as something that no longer works for the people because the institution has started to serve its own interests. There's several books, one in particular that for some reason I'm forgetting the title of, by Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman, writing about the propaganda model of media as this thing where the media as an institution serves its own interests and serves the interests of those who own it. And that's a presumption that a lot of activists operate under. And I guess one of the main messages that I have for you here today is sort of the disadvantages for activists of thinking of the media in that total way, that sort of totally captured, totally corrupt way. Because of course, if you think of the media as only 100% all of the time serving the interests of the most powerful people in our society, it can be very discouraging, right? You start thinking that like, oh, there's no reason for me to engage with the media, the sort of commercial mass media. There's no way that I can have my perspective put out there at all. It's kind of hopeless. And I want to present a slightly different view of the problems of the media, that one that does allow for people coming from an outside perspective to get their voices heard in that venue. Before we go into that, just very quickly, I've already said we're going to talk about the mass media rather than the independent media. I also want to highlight the fact that there are some other broader issues within that are sort of related to this discussion that we're not going to be talking about today. Things like, your interaction with the media is going to be dictated by your model for change. A lot of people believe that social change happens on a very one-to-one basis, that we need to go out and have conversations with people. Some people have the other viewpoint that representation in the media of alternate perspectives is very important. So that's a question that's outside of the context, oh, here we go, of this discussion. So from a more radical activist perspective, your model for social change is going to dictate how you approach something like a street protest, a lockdown. Other examples would be like a tree sit if you're trying to shut down an intersection. there's a connection between these small activist gestures and your larger ideas about how social change works and your role as somebody who's sending out a message in making that social change happen. That's something to think about because that boils down to the next level down, again, something that we might talk about but is not the focus here, the question, do we want media attention? If we do want media attention, why? What's the role of that media attention in our longer strategy? If we don't want media attention, also, again, why? Why do we not want it? So these are the larger questions that are sort of framing the workshop today. They're not things that we're going to directly discuss. So we talked briefly about the idea of the propaganda model. And there are several models that sort of attempt to explain theoretically why we have this sensation that the media is not performing its role correctly, why we don't see ourselves reflected accurately in the media, for example. One is the propaganda model. One is this idea that the media, because they are owned by big businesses, because they are controlled by powerful people, are not going to represent the perspectives or the agendas of progressives who might be working to undermine the most powerful people in our society. It's one model. Another model is what we can call a structures and routines model of the media and its shortcomings. And when we're talking about the structures and routines of the media, and we have a couple, looks like, representatives of media of one sort or another here who might be able to offer us some insight into this. But what we're focusing on is the idea of a media institution as, do we have an order? Yes, please order food. Support the institution that's allowing us to have this workshop. So what we're thinking about when we're talking about structures and routines of the media as institutions is we're thinking about the daily routines of reporters, of newsrooms, of editors, as they make decisions about what to cover and what not to cover. And I want to start by asking how much do people know, and for now I'll exclude people who are working reporters of any kind, but those who are not, what do you know, or what are your impressions of the sort of daily lives of reporters, maybe their workloads, their job situations? What do people know? Anybody?
They make big money.
I'll let that stand for a moment. Let's have more suggestions. And they can be very general. Anybody, any ideas?
Well, it's a glamorous type of activity.
Okay, it's glamorous. Is let's get on. Okay, I'm going to try this one more time. So, okay, glamorous. We'll go with that for a second. Other ideas, like for example, why do people go into reporting?
I guess there are young people that like to travel and like to learn about things that are going on around the world.
Okay,
Like being on TV?
like being on TV.
Well, I mean, what kind of reporting are we talking about?
Yeah.
What are we discussing?
We're talking about people who go into newspaper or television reporting or maybe radio reporting for whether you're talking about CNN, Tampa Bay Times, local NBC, people who become news anchors, people who are doing this as like a full-time professional job or trying to. So just to put things in perspective, the average starting salary for a journalist, and this again includes this includes like the broad spectrum of people working as professional journalists, but the starting salary currently is $30,000 a year. And by some standards, well, it's all very relative, but for a professional, college-educated graduate. That's very much at the low end of starting salaries. Currently, for those who don't know, news organizations are undergoing massive consolidations. So newspapers are getting bought by other newspapers, television stations are getting bought by other television stations, and as a consequence, people are being asked to do, and this is a phrase that we're hearing all over the place. Come on in.
They also have an expense account generally if they're outside their office, which is,
So that might add to that
which
number a little
can
bit.
be, substantial.
But people's workloads are increasing constantly as they're, and this is a phrase that we're hearing everywhere, but people are being asked to do more with less. Just like we're being asked in government, in education, to do more with less, people in journalism are being asked to do more with less, which means that their workloads are constantly expanding. And so this structures and routines perspective on how the media works involves a picture of journalists as people who, like many of us, are overworked, underpaid, are constantly just trying to get their jobs done as well as they can. And they're under a lot of pressure to produce work that pleases their editors, their bosses. And so coming from that perspective, and again, that perspective is arguable. Maybe people do see journalists as having a glamorous life, and maybe they're attracted by that, and maybe that makes up for the sometimes low salaries. Because remember, talking 30,000 as an average, there's a lot of people below that. So with that in mind, from that model, what can we think about a reporter's motivations? What are they looking out for as they go through their daily routines? What are they trying to accomplish? What is their just sort of perspective as they move through the world, or their mindset as they go through their daily work?
You want to find the story that gets them out of the newsroom into the spotlight.
So they're looking for, if they're looking to advance their careers, they're looking for like big stories. Okay, so maybe that's one part of it. Not every story can be a big story. One thing that kind of blew my mind, and I just read this the other day, but the average newspaper reporter currently can write, well, I don't know if this is average. A newspaper reporter can write as many as 12 stories in a single day. So not every one of those is going to be some investigative masterpiece. If you're writing 12 stories in a day, what are you looking out for?
Local interest.
Okay, local interest, or
The interest of your publication.
right. We can start more generally with the idea that you want something that's going to be interesting, period. That's going to attract the reader, that's going to be compelling to your editor. Because you go through a screening process, as I'm sure most of you guys can probably guess, you're pitching stories, right? You're talking to your editor and convincing them that what you're trying to write about is interesting and compelling. So you have to get that done, and you have to, this is interesting.
Because I'm going to take off, but I'm interested if you share your email and any other contact information, because we in Pacifica would probably love you as a local media analyst to come on in the next few days.
Oh, sure. Do you have a piece of paper?
Yeah,
I'm
of course.
realizing that I
Sorry,
completely forgot to bring cards. Just right here?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, you have to go.
You're obviously you're Tampa Bay based.
Yeah, I've just completely forgotten. I didn't introduce myself, so maybe this is a good opportunity. I'm David Z. Morris. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at USF in Tampa. My main work is actually about globalization and social change primarily through culture. So I'm actually not a specialist in politics, but I work with activist groups and do this kind of stuff kind of on the side. I'm currently mainly affiliated with a group called Awake Pinellas, and if anybody's curious, I'll just pass around a couple little information about them. And I do some media work for them. My degree is in media studies from the University of Iowa a couple years back. Sorry, I need to do this real quick.
Your email also.
Yeah, I'm a Minsky, AMINSKY at kpfk.org. I'm the program director at KPFK Los Angeles.
There you go.
I think that's what
You got Houston?
Los Angeles.
Los Angeles.
That's KPFT in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
I'm KPFK And thank you, everybody.
So let me see if I can figure out where I'm on this. Okay. So you have these overworked, and right now we're talking about the structures and routines, understanding of how the media works. So you have these overworked journalists who are looking to write stories as quickly as possible. This is why currently as much as half of the news that shows up in newspapers, on television, and on radio are essentially rewritten versions of press releases from public relations companies working, and obviously people who are able to employ public relations representatives generally are major corporations. Some large unions do this too, obviously, but overwhelmingly, again, it's people with money and power who often are directly writing stories that show up in relatively unmodified forms in newspapers and on television because reporters are so overworked that they cannot go out and, in many cases, write Pulitzer Prize winning investigative pieces. They can't dig up all the facts themselves. They don't have the time to wrap their heads around every implication of what a story means for the larger society. And so when you're talking about the structures and routines of a daily newspaper or a media outlet like a television station, and you're trying to cater to those reporters, it becomes your job as an activist to tell them what's important about a story, to tell them what your perspective is, to make it something that's a good story for them, something that's going to get past their bosses, that they can write really quickly, and that is going to attract an audience. And this is the sort of sad reality, unfortunately, is that the news is a commercial enterprise that has to attract an audience, and that's the bottom line for many of them. And so that's, as we're approaching mass media as activists, it's something that we have to keep in mind. How do we make a story interesting? How do we make our story interesting in a way that's going to attract people to it? I'm going to backtrack just really briefly to talk about the motivations of reporters in a way that is hopefully a little bit more hopeful, because I talked about this idea of the fourth estate, right? We have journalists and media institutions that we sort of imagine in an ideal world, and in the past this maybe was more the case, acting as a check on government. And a lot of journalists think of themselves in this way as well. A lot of professional journalists go into it out of a sense of public service and out of a sense of idealism. And so when we're, as activists, approaching these people, one of the most dangerous traps, as I've mentioned, is to get into thinking like, well, they're completely controlled by their corporate masters, they're never going to do anything that reflects my perspective. Many of these people, and they do obviously come from across the political spectrum, but regardless, many of them are interested in, as much as possible, representing the public interest and doing stuff that serves their ideals of acting as a check on the government. And so that's another thing to keep in mind when you're trying to approach the media, is that many of them, even if they're not on your side entirely, they care about public issues and they care about their role in representing those issues to the public. So there's a couple of others, really briefly, for reasons of time I'm going to gloss over them, but obviously when you're dealing with especially television, but also radio and to a lesser extent newspaper, there's a limited amount of time and space for representing any given story. And so that's why we have soundbite culture, basically. We have 15-second, one-sentence clips that get repeated over and over again in the coverage of any given story. And again, it's an unfortunate reality, but it's one that if you're really trying to make an impact in the media as an activist, it's a reality that you have to deal with. We're not going to get into great depth about this today, but just the general idea that you need to be able to say what your issue is, what your agenda is, what matters about your story in 15 to 20 seconds.
Sorry.
Oh, well,
Just
there we go.
don't believe the liberal media.
Great example, except that, well, I guess this has changed recently, but many people who who spout that line about the liberal media also happen to be people who have their own boutique media who deal specifically with their perspective. It's gotten a little bit more even over the last 10 years. We have narrowcast media on both sides of the political spectrum. But again, what we're talking about here today is ideally more mass audiences. Right? And by the way, anybody can chime in. Feel free to just throw your hand up.
Okay, so you're allowed to talk ask questions during the time?
Yeah. I've got a couple of points where I'm really soliciting questions, but please chime in.
So you still see the majority of journalists as the public good instead of now that a lot of people see journalists just delivering their own political worldview, like Fox on one side, MSC on the one side. They really aren't looking for the truth at all. They're just looking for their ideological standpoint. And
Well, there's an important distinction to be made between journalists and the people we see on Fox or MSNBC who are more personalities, really, and the phrase talking heads, people who do go on and their job is to be opinionated. Their job is to present a particular perspective, and it's entertainment, very much so, and you have to deal with those outlets in a different way, and arguably it's easier, for example, to get a story about. There was a story about a local protest that showed up on Huffington Post a couple weeks ago. There are channels where sympathetic journalists will represent what you're talking about. What I'm concerned with here is more like the Tampa Bay Times, for example. Certainly not a politically hostile outlet for progressives or leftists, but also, it's not by any means associated with left perspectives or progressive perspectives. But if you approach those journalists correctly and we'll talk more about this, but if you find the people who do share your perspective or at least are sympathetic and open to it, they'll write a story that's going to appear neutral while getting your message out. And that's kind of the ideal, is that you have something that looks, or that really is, it's news. It's a story about what you're doing that doesn't just echo your perspective. It actually, gets your message out in a neutral venue, because that's really the most powerful. If you're just sending out your messages through partisan outlets on either side, and with all due respect to Pacifica, to other small outlets, they are very much affiliated with specific perspectives. And so the most powerful thing you can do, I believe, is to get those represented in more sort of mainstream neutral outlets. And we'll talk about why that is in just a second.
But I mean, you're just suggesting how to reach the mainstream news outlets, because I mean, I've been in protests and I've heard from friends in protests where they have mainstream news outlets where, I mean, you can't be have a bigger story than like police brutality, even on those journalists, but they won't take up those stories. The only time you ever hear a story about that if it's something like that one lady in Egypt who got oppressed. But I mean, if they won't even write about protest your oppression, how do you get through to them? Because
that's a complex discussion. But I mean, just to take the most immediate recent example is that I mean those events did get huge coverage as recently as this past October, November for Occupy Wall Street, and I want to address that specific example, and we'll talk about why that maybe was effective, where in other instances it hasn't been, or something like that. So let me just keep moving really quickly here. So we have this idea that we have limited time, and then finally, and the most complex problem in addressing these mainstream media outlets is this idea of ideological hegemony, that these outlets have a very specific perspective that basically coincides with like the most conventional thinking of the American public as a whole. And obviously, if our goal is to try and shift that dialogue, shift what the conventional wisdom is, it requires a certain amount of like kung fu, because you're trying to approach somebody who is coming from a very mainstream, very narrow perspective, and get them to tell a story that somehow conveys the message that there are alternatives, that there are different ways of thinking about the issue. And we'll get a couple of examples of how you.
Why haven't we heard the word editor? when these young people that get a job, or old people that get a job as a journalist, and they go anywhere that they wanna work, these guys that work in it can tell you the editor is the one that puts the bit in their mouth.
Right. Exactly. That's
and
the.
that they get taught at a very young age, journalistically speaking, they get the habit of how they can act and how they can, what they can say and what they can't, what are their parameters,
Right.
and that sticks.
Yeah, and that's the routines and structures that we were talking about earlier. That you go to your editor, you're trying to get these stories approved, and you're right. Maybe
What
I
I'm
didn't
saying is
emphasize.
the editor has, the boss is, he's the one that everything funnels to him, and he has to answer to the boss's politics or philosophy or lack thereof.
Right. So the boss is the boss. The boss controls you absolutely, and you do have to get through that filter, and that definitely affects how your stories are framed. But the thing to keep in mind, just looking objectively at what shows up in the media, is that you know, left-wing perspectives do get represented, maybe not consistently, and certainly not always the most sympathetically. But there are things. I mean, the media coverage of Occupy Wall Street in October and November was crucial to it gaining steam. So those things do get through, and the question is how, why, how do we make it happen consistently? So these are all limitations, but I want to talk about why we have to work against these limitations, despite our tendency to get discouraged about things like corporate control. Because there are a large number of people for whom things like the television news, the nightly news, newspapers, and mainstream radio news broadcasts are a major source of information. Obviously, many of us in this room probably pay more attention to things like blogs, more boutique things, MSNBC, maybe more narrow things that cater to our political agenda, sort of more horse race oriented stuff if we're really trying to get somebody elected, for example, or in many cases things like Indie Media and Pacifica that are outside of the mainstream. But a lot of people really do still rely on those mainstream media outlets to get their view of the world. And this is a list of sort of features of the people who do tend to rely more on mainstream media. People with less life experience, who have not gone out and maybe found all these alternative perspectives already, people with fewer resources, people with less vitality, less education, and fewer alternatives do tend to rely on commercial and mass media more. Now, these are all very general features, but just looking at that, what kind of people maybe are we describing here? What are some examples of demographic groups that are being described by these features?
The poor.
The poor,
Working class.
working class,
Older people.
older people,
But also young people.
also young people.
Very young.
Absolutely.
And a lot of the middle class too. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, think about some of us may be able to think about ourselves at age 14 or 15, stuck out in the suburbs with no idea what a protest is, much less what it feels like to go to one. So we've talked about you know, working class, poor, elderly, minorities maybe. Now, how do these people fit into the political agenda that some of y'all might represent or be trying to advance?
They get swallowed by the information they get on Fox News or CNN.
Absolutely. So,
I disagree with some of this. The problem that we have is, I don't think it's with the poor or less educated. The problem we have is, well, it really comes back down to families or lack thereof, but people don't see that they have a responsibility for government. I think we make a mistake when we label things socialist or progressive or right-wing or conservative. That turns people off. That's what the big outlets do. They harp on a 3 to 5 word phrase and they'll beat it in your brain, and suddenly you're brainwashed, like weapons of mass destruction.
right.
You're going to hear it Fast and Furious. You're going to hear it ad infinitum between now and November. But people, well, they've ceased teaching government or civics or much of anything in schools. But further than teaching, people, young people especially, and older people particularly, don't see that they have a responsibility, or they don't see it. In Australia, there's a legal requirement that you vote. Here, we're going the other way. The ones that think it's better off for this group or that group not to vote, they don't want anybody to vote. My congressional district number 5 in Texas, very small group of people that vote Republican primary. And they control.
This is a really important point, and I want
people don't have a responsibility. In fact, I'd venture to say that most people in this room don't feel a responsibility for government. They may want to talk about it, they may want to this and that, but as far as responsibility, that they have a job.
Right.
That is part of their, I think, see as our life responsibility number 3 on the list.
This is a really important
recreation.
point, and I agree with you totally. I do. It's sort of the idea here is sort of a little bit of a split mindset, because on the one hand, the circumstances that we're trying to deal with here are pretty horrible. The idea that people get most of their ideas about politics from the media is, I think, unfortunate. I think that it would be much better if we had, like you're saying, families conveying values, communities where people communicated with one another directly, and were able to, have constant dialogue, face to face, and where people felt more responsibility. I guess the real question is, how do we take the circumstances in which we find ourselves and try and create that using the tools that we have to
The
deal with?
consequences of what's going on, they've done studies, the top 20% of earners versus the lower 40%, and all the numbers, the top 20, less divorces, less this, the bottom 40, blah, 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 just tanking. And a guy asked a question of the guy that wrote the book. He says, well, what about the 40% you didn't talk about? The 41% to the 79%. He says they're going downward. He didn't write his book on that, but he said they're going down. Well, see, when something's going, I don't care whether it's a car or political ideology, you don't change direction until you stop. You have to stop. You can't go this way and then go that way without first stopping. We're in for a big stop.
So we have people in the lower socioeconomic classes who are at a huge disadvantage, and I want to make very clear that when I'm talking about this group of people who are more influenced by mass media, I'm certainly not trying to blame anybody. I'm not trying to say that, oh, the poor don't understand reality. It's just that the reality is that many of them don't have access to alternative frames, or maybe they do and they haven't connected to larger dialogues. For example, this room here is fairly homogenous, and I would say that a lot of the people here to protest the RNC represent a fairly narrow socioeconomic spectrum, and that's due to the fact that we have a limited representation of perspectives in the mass media, where a lot of people get the bulk of their ideas.
So you could say that it's part of the problem is the decline in print media and the shrink in the scope and the capacity of the print media that remains, because that used to be a great source of information and for news for people.
And it is
Before
still
it was
more.
all TV all the time.
Yeah, I mean, it is still more diverse than television for sure. I mean, many of the local stories that have been represented well in the past few months that I've seen have come from Tampa Bay Times specifically. So, print media still has more options and more flexibility. I want to keep moving so that I can get through more of this without keeping you guys too long. So when you're thinking about your own story and your own perspective, there are a couple of ideas that I want to get across. One is that, and maybe the most important, is that when you're trying to craft a story, that if you're trying to pitch to large media outlets, you want to be thinking in terms of shared values. You as an activist are trying to change society in a particular way, and you want it. You're trying to make it fit your values and ideals. And much of the time, those values and ideals are the same as those who are, not activists, people who may be less connected to discourses that you think are important. we'll talk about word choice as well, but for now I want to go on to, this is the result of a survey that tried to outline core American values. And of course, as an activist, you're trying to change some of these. But this is the trick. This is the sort of kung fu that I was talking about. That as you go in trying to represent your activist perspective, you can hook into these basic values in places where they coincide with your own and redefine them. Give them some different spin, and then use that to appeal to the mass audience while still advancing your agenda. So, this is a long list, and there are a few that really do cry out for an activist perspective and that do really align very easily with a progressive agenda. So things like responsible capitalism, with the emphasis on the responsible. Obviously, not everybody here or everywhere is even in favor of capitalism, but we can hook into that responsibility, and that's been a huge factor already in the election that's unfolded so far. Obviously, the story of Romney's role in bank capital has been a major, major negative for him. And so that's an example of a story that has played well because it has hooked into these fundamental values. Others, ethical leadership. By the same token, Americans don't stand for corruption in their leaders if it's obvious. We can talk about defining corruption, but people who are really engaged in corrupt practices that are very easily interpreted as such don't last very long.
Unless you spend money in their pocket.
Well, if you can document that somebody is directly taking bribes, they're in trouble. There are all kinds of shady backroom dealings that we have yet to successfully frame as unethical. So things like, I don't know, I'm thinking back a few years here, but things like Dick Cheney's connections to, oh gosh, now I'm blanking, Halliburton, or more recently,
They get $500 million in Nigeria.
yeah, and more recently, the people who have sort of been on a revolving door between Merrill Lynch and the Fed, those can be framed as instances of unethical leadership. They have not been successfully defined that way in the media, and that's part of our failure to advance an agenda that would take those people out of that rotation, is because we haven't been able to define it as unethical as strongly as we would like to.
Sure, where did you say the list came from?
The specific, I don't have the title of the article, but the researchers' name are Shoemaker and Reese. It's from an article published in 2005. Obviously, this is just one list, and there are lots of others that would hit some of the same points and some different ones. Another really fruitful potential place to hook in is this idea of small town pastoralism. That is, Americans really are a fan of things that are local, things that are small scale. On some of these other lists of American values, you will find things like, in a David and Goliath story, Americans generally tend to favor the underdog. And that's a way to frame a story that can be very effective for activists. And it's one of the reasons why Romney is at such a disadvantage, is because he is very much seen as Goliath in David versus Goliath. And hooked into all of them. So, very briefly on the issue of words, another thing to keep in mind is that words matter a lot. The specific uses of words matter a lot. Just very briefly, one example from an issue that is unfortunately kind of decided against what most progressives would see as ideal. Can anybody help me? What's the difference between affirmative action and racial preference?
The intended stated purpose of affirmative action is to rebalance circumstances that are out of balance for people who are, for example, seeking a job or admission to a school.
Uh-huh.
But then who defines how that's out of balance, and then how it's going to change as the balance shifts, is really not very well addressed. It's not in the media.
So in terms of how it sounds and how we perceive it, at least in your first gloss, that your definition of affirmative action sounds really good. What is racial preference? How does that sound to our ears?
It's negative.
It sounds negative. in effect, they're very similar. I mean, affirmative action is one specific instance of racial preference. But when people start talking about racial preference, for example, in college admissions.
Well, but it is not necessarily true because when, like she says, there has been an unbalance, in treatment of people for many years, and we have to correct that. Then it's not, racial preference. It is correcting a wrong. So
Right.
It's like she said, the trick is to know when to stop.
And you can think
when
very
not to go.
specifically about the meanings of those words and phrases. So affirmative, by definition, is positive, right? It's a good thing. Affirmative action. It's a good action that you're taking. So whoever chose that phrase, even though it has been, progressively rolled back, they did a very good job of choosing that phrase because it has such a good ring to it. It sounds positive. Racial preference sounds like what it is, which is something that doesn't really align with most Americans' values. And so when people who were fighting affirmative action started referring to affirmative action policies, specifically in higher education, as racial preference, that was a big negative for people who were in favor of those policies. That shift of the terms hurt those activists.
So framing the issue with your own, what they call code word, is a huge practice.
Exactly. And it is a practice. It's something that you get better at.
The classic example, pro-choice, anti-life.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And now we think of that issue as pro-choice and pro-life, which is, in both cases, a positive thing that has been defined by the party on that side of the debate. So in some sense, they've actually lost competitive advantage because they're both good things, right? We're all pro-choice. I mean, I'm not talking about the specific policy, but we all want people to have choices in life in general. And it's pretty hard to be anti-life, except for, one of my favorite authors is H.P. Lovecraft. He's anti-life. But most people are in general pro-life, so they've defined both of those things in positive terms. I'm passing around a couple of books that if people are interested in getting deeper into these discussions, these are both good books on everything from framing to news routines and how to understand how a newsroom works. So I do want, and we might, I guess I was pegging this at an hour. We might go a little bit over time because there are a couple of more important things, but if anybody needs to leave, please feel free. When you're trying to deal with mass media and with reporters, there are a few things to keep in mind. This is a section I call Dancing with the Devil, because as we've established, there are some problems with mass media, but you're trying to make the most out of it. So we've talked about this image of a reporter who's underpaid, who's overworked, who's grinding away at their job, really just trying to survive. And so you, as somebody who's bringing a story to them, need to cater to that reporter in a few specific ways. Think about their need for speed. They write all these stories a day, so the more work you can do for them in giving them the facts, giving them well-researched facts, telling them what the story is, and this is something that you might have some degree of ethical issue with. Obviously, we want our reporters to be out there with their hats on and their press pass sticking out of it, looking for the facts, going from door to door. That simply isn't the reality in most cases. And so it's your responsibility to actually do the reporting, to actually find the facts and pass them on to the reporter, who's then going to write the story.
Not only that, but where you got the facts so that they can fact check it themselves.
Exactly. Yeah, and obviously accurate facts. You're doing yourself no favors if you try and misrepresent the truth in the long term, because, we'll skip timing this and get back to it, but reliability over the long term is going to be one of your greatest strengths as somebody who's trying to push for a representation of your perspective in the media. Because again, reporters have very limited time, and what they do, and in many cases this is a bad thing, but they're going to go to the same sources again and again and again for perspectives on issues that somebody is an expert in. So I get contacted occasionally by people who want comments about media. And so I try and be reliable as a source doing that so that I can maybe represent a little bit more of my perspective. Reliability means things like showing up on time, giving them the, we'll talk a little bit more about that stuff as well, but just in general, think about reliability, be there, be available for people. Timeliness, there are some specifics here to think about. Journalists obviously have deadlines, and for many newspapers, traditionally those deadlines are 11 p.m. or midnight. One of the phenomena that's happening lately is that as more and more newspapers get bought by larger and larger conglomerates, they're sharing printing presses. The deadline traditionally for a newspaper was midnight because that's when the newspaper got printed. Now, as more papers are sharing printing presses, that deadline gets earlier and earlier for some papers because they're getting printed first. So, for example, some daily papers are now printed as early as 6 p.m. the night before. So you can often just ask a reporter, when's your deadline, if you happen to talk to them. And that's information that you, if you end up being a media representative for your organization, can then use to time events to, let's say, don't put on an event at 7 p.m. because it's going to be very difficult for a reporter then to be there for the event, take pictures, which are an important part of newspaper reporting and of obviously television reporting, and then edit the story and get it done by even an 11 p.m. deadline, much less maybe an 8 p.m. deadline, and obviously at 6 p.m. deadline it's impossible. And then by the time they get the chance to write another story, you're old news. So if you want to put on an event, put it on at noon, put it on at 1. That gives that reporter plenty of time to get out, see it, write about it, and get it in before the deadline. Clarity in especially writing a press release. Think about giving that reporter as much information as you can and specifically answer the 5 or 6 questions that reporters need to be able to answer in their stories. Who, what, when, where, and why. And sometimes how, although that's a little bit complicated for some reporters. So give them the information that's going to allow them to write a clear story. And then the final and sort of most difficult to define and pin down element of this is newsworthiness. And I put it in quotes here for a very specific reason. Because what many of us and what many people in general might consider newsworthy, things like environmental disasters that are happening around us every day, global warming that's getting worse and worse with every passing moment. These are things that many of us consider newsworthy. But they're not newsworthy from the perspective of many mainstream media outlets because they're lacking a certain set of features that allow them to attract audiences. And again, as we've established, attracting audiences is really the core motivating factor for many of these reporters. And again, that's not a great thing. I'm by no means saying that's a good thing. It's just a reality. And so when you think about newsworthiness, there are a few features. I don't know if this is my next slide or not. Okay, good. So when we talk about newsworthiness, we can also often talk about a hook, something that's going to grab a reader's attention. And those are things like action, and action can include providing good photographs. If you have an event that's going on and you know that it's going to photograph well, you can include that in your correspondence with a reporter. Say, we're going to have 50 people out here doing such and such. And again, flashing back to reliability, if you say you're going to have 50 people, make sure that you actually have 50 people. Because if you burn a reporter once on a trip that takes them 20 minutes to get to and 20 minutes back, they might not do it again. They might not come out to the next thing you announce to. So interest is a very vague thing. You know, is it going to be of interest to their readers? Relevance, so that can include, for example, right now, because the RNC has such dominance over Tampa Bay, anything related to the RNC is relevant. Proximity, is it about a local area? Is it about a local issue? It's a lot easier to pitch a local story to a local outlet. That obviously goes without saying. Celebrity, if you have a big name affiliated with your event, that's going to be more likely to get coverage. And novelty, is it something that hasn't happened before? And this is one of the things that I want us, if people are interested in sticking around for a little bit, I'm interested in discussing in the context of protests of the RNC. Because this is just my take, but there's an interesting tone to the coverage of protests of the RNC this time around, which is it's being treated as something routine, something that is being managed, something that we've all seen before, and something that is going to have no impact except for the sort of momentary inconvenience for people trying to get through traffic. And that hits on the novelty thing. How do we establish novelty in our activism in a way that forces the media to cover us in a way different than, oh, here's more protesters?
Spontaneity.
Spontaneity, unpredictability, that's definitely one. Blow through a couple of quick basics that might be helpful. Get organized, and by that I mean literally form an organization. Pick a name for you and your 5 friends that's going to sound like you have some sort of infrastructure behind you. And literally, if you have 12 people who are working consistently, you are an organization, and so you might as well choose a name and use that name to establish some legitimacy over time. Write press releases. You can look up what does a press release look like, and you can find some good examples. Usually it's about 3 paragraphs giving the very basic information about what has happened or what is going to happen. Which, by the way, I mentioned that about half of current news in things like television and newspapers comes from PR firms. Something like 2/3 of all news is coverage of pre-planned events. So, again, we have this sort of image in our minds of the reporter who's out there looking for the story, and for various reasons, mostly having to do with the decline of funding for newsmakers, that's not really the case. Reporters are sitting at their desks waiting to get emails that are going to give them leads to stories. Most stories come from pre-planned events and messages sent out either by, mainly by public relations firms, but also hopefully by activists, if you take that route. We already mentioned reliability. That's sort of tied up in the idea of building relationships with specific reporters. So look at something like the Tampa Bay Times. Find stories that you feel represent your perspective accurately and get the name of those reporters. Get their names, write down their emails. In most newspapers now, the emails of individual reporters are actually included with the stories. And if they're not, they're probably not written by local people anyway. So especially, if you're trying to work locally, make a contact list. And send, as you read the newspaper or watch the news, that list will get longer as you add names to it of people who you feel might be sympathetic to your perspective. And then you let those people know what's happening, and they'll come out. Become a source. This is a little bit more complicated. We're just going to skip that. Again, be reliable. Do what you say you're going to do. Be on time. All that stuff that some of us have problems with. And then finally, I've already talked about, make it seem important by telling them that people are going to be there. Get asses in seats. If you have people showing up for something, it's newsworthy. And the more people you have showing up for something, the more newsworthy it is. This is especially true for television. When they get shots of lots and lots of people standing around, it helps them establish the fact that the story is actually legitimate, that there is something happening. And it doesn't take a lot. You can have, 30 people standing on the steps of City Hall or the courthouse or whatever. They provide those nice steps so you can make it really look like a lot of people really easily. And you do that, cameras are going to be appreciative because that looks good on television. Another sort of newer phenomenon, maybe in the past 5 years, is that a lot of stories in the mass media come from blogs originally. And you can make contact with blogs, which are often run by non-professionals, they're run by locals, and let them know about a story. And bloggers are often not going to be able to come out and actually report on a story, but they might, write something about it, write some commentary, and then, this often happens on the right, and we hear about it. I don't know if he's actually as relevant as he was 10 years ago, but the Drudge Report is a big one for writing about small stories that then get picked up, and they're often stories that are very damaging to left-wing perspectives, by the way. So you can look for. Come on in. So you can look for. This is just a couple of examples. These are blogs for the Progressive News, St. Peter's blog, for a Progressive Coalition blog. These are people who might be easier to access than mass media reporters, but who, when they write about something, they make the story more relevant and more likely to get picked up by those large outlets.
A corollary here. In addition to cultivating blogs, you might consider having your organization establish a blog, or when you create your organization, register a domain name and put up a website, which makes you look much more efficient.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I mean, a domain name costs $10, and anybody that's got any skills can put one up in an hour.
Yeah, absolutely. And even if it's just like like you guys see the flyers that I handed out for Awake, and awakepinellas.org is currently just really like a splash page with like one video up, but it does again add that air of legitimacy that's really important. And you know, I wish I had brought more explicit examples, but Awake Pinellas is a pretty big network, but at any given time it's 12 people sitting in a room. So it just shows that this is like a small thing that you can do with a small number of people.
That's how MoveOn got started.
Right. Yeah, so lots of examples, and that's now a gigantic organization.
In a lot of major news outlets, a lot of the small blogs of those stories filter up. And I mean, you'll see it all the time. Major news sources reporting and quoting comments by anonymous users on Reddit. People with screen names. They'll comment. They'll quote blog comments.
Right.
So,
yeah, it's a brave new world.
So these things filter up.
Yeah, I want to make one last point, and then we're going to actually open it up for a broader discussion. And that's about sound bites. And this is like a really, really, well, it's arguable. It goes both ways. But many of us would consider this a kind of negative aspect of our current news culture, is this idea that you have to be able to get your idea across so quickly because it's going to be in this very compressed format. The other side of this, one that I would invite people to just think about, is that often, maybe in life you've found this in other venues, but often the more you understand something, the more quickly you're able to convey its essence in a way that really translates to a lot of people. So if you, as an individual, are sort of struggling to get the sort of basic message and figure out what it is, and you feel like you need 20 minutes to explain yourself, maybe there's some of that responsibility that lies on you to polish your message so that you know what your message is very specifically. And be able to say, you know, maybe you can run this by friends and say, okay, here's really where I stand. Here's what's important about my perspective, and say it in 20 seconds. Practice it. Get better at that. And you know, it's sure we'd all like to sit down and have a 20-minute conversation with everybody that we want to convert to our viewpoint. But again, this is kind of the overarching message of this whole presentation is we may not like reality, but this is reality. And now I want to just open it up to a kind of exercise or discussion. I mean, obviously we're all here to one degree or another. The RNC is here whether we like it or not, and some of us are here specifically for the RNC. And so I'm curious what people have seen in terms of framings or depictions of protests, of activists who are here to kind of oppose the RNC, how people have been treated by the media, and you know what people's impressions are of that treatment, and maybe we can start thinking about how we change that dialogue. Thinking about, you know, what is your message, who are your audience? Maybe we can think about what our common values are with people out there, and try and construct some key phrases for it. And obviously people at this table are coming from a lot of different perspectives. But just to start off, what kind of coverage have people seen of the sort of other side of the RNC, of people who are here to demonstrate or resist the RNC in some way? Because by the way, this is really important, paying attention to how you're covered. You're not going to be able to construct your own message really effectively unless you are paying attention to how you're already being covered.
Violent anarchists.
Okay.
That word has so many negative connotations attached to it, and it's always preceded by violent or some kind of implication of that. I mean, I haven't been as plugged in with the activist scene lately, but everything I read is like, violent anarchists going to do this or that, and you know, they attach them to anonymous, even though it's not a organization at all.
Right.
Yeah.
There almost seems to be kind of a psychotic break with reality in its treatment of anarchists. It's this overblown smoke monster fear, you know, and it doesn't seem to tie to reality.
So this is what we call, you know, we were talking about ideological hegemony, and I dropped the term framing a couple of times, and I didn't really go into it because it's kind of a complex thing that I this is an example. I don't entirely understand framing inside and out, and so I can't explain it in 15 seconds like I can some of these other things.
Well, demonizing in a nutshell. Just like you said, with a word preceding like violent and
Right.
another word ending with ist.
Framing in general is the idea that you're going to understand things in one specific way that transfers across a lot of different stories. And so the frame of protesters for the RNC, or at least one frame that surfaces again and again, is this idea of violence. And it is often wedded to anarchists. And so that's arguably a really damaging frame for activists, because people are seen as kind of chaotic or out to cause trouble rather than having a political agenda that's part of free speech. And that's, just to give you an example, that's an alternative frame. That's an alternative way of understanding the dissent that's coming with the RNC, is something that's based on principles of free speech. And when we've had good coverage of resistance to the RNC, that's often been an underlying frame or an explicit frame, is this idea of how do we get free speech.
Do the protesters come with violence, or is the violence a reaction to the authorities' decisions about how to corral the group?
That's an excellent alternative frame that you just put in.
Well, that's the reason I came, is to answer something along those lines, question for me. I, from what I've seen, and it's not been a lot, I haven't seen a level of violence. If I was gonna go protest and be violent, believe me, I could raise hell.
Yeah.
It's
If
definitely the
if I
latter.
came with the idea in my head that I was ready to be violent to make myself heard, seen, or something like that, it's not a problem.
So you had the two-word phrase, violent anarchists. What's the two-word phrase for the idea that we just had introduced?
Clashes. Or what's the
Starts with
What
a P.
Peaceful protests?
No, the opposite of that. There's the violent anarchists on one side, and there's
Anarchy's against the government, right? I'm not
Yeah.
an anarchist.
there's violent anarchists and
have
there's police
umpires.
brutality,
Oh.
right?
Baseball doesn't
Yeah.
work without umpires.
Police brutality is the alternative frame that presents some of the same stories that might come across framed as, here's the work of violent anarchists. And police brutality spins it around and makes it into a David versus Goliath story where, again, people are very sympathetic to the underdog. If you look back at Occupy Wall Street, and what are the things that really made that explode? It's videos of women and kneeling students getting pepper sprayed by guys in body armor. And so when you're talking about the narrative that is underlying a piece of news coverage, you can connect it to these larger themes. And that David versus Goliath story is one that's very, very powerful for activists. And obviously you can't like manufacture something like what happened at UC Davis, but those kids were tuned in enough to that way of thinking that they approached it the right way. Most of you will probably know the video that I'm referring to, where there are about 12 or 13 activists kneeling with their arms locked as a fat cop in body armor pepper sprays them all in the face.
So you just escalate by using the adjective fat.
Well, see,
You
I'm
did
going to frame it myself.
No, I'm serious now. You did something that was unnecessary, and that people, I listen to them on the news all the time. They add these little adjectives and adverbs around, and you said earlier words are important.
Mhm.
Well, see, when we buy in, like if you and I are having a discussion or an argument, if one of us just stops and doesn't say anything, but is intently looking the other one in the eye and listening, how long is that conversation gonna last?
Yeah, it's definitely about intent.
Well, what I'm saying is that we, as people, are just as responsible and just as needy of learning how to espouse what it is that we're after as the other side. We're just as bad,
You're right.
if not worse. Sometimes we're worse because we have the culture on our side. We can play to the rock and roll and the smoking the pot and all this stuff that the far right, they don't have that option, and they don't have that big a universe of people to drop on. We can't get anybody to vote, but we're
Yeah.
accepted and they're not.
But what
So
made
the-
that interesting though was the fact that there were video cameras there and it was captured as a video. It
Yeah.
would have been a less effective story had it been written.
Absolutely. And we haven't really talked too much about, video and in that case, I believe that the specific video was actually shot by an amateur, not by a journalist. So people were there ready to make the news themselves,
They
which is a whole other
confiscated the
issue.
videos as much as they could.
Yeah, and they will do that.
California too.
So that's another topic for discussion is how do you make the media? And it's a powerful one and there's a lot going on there that's changing the landscape. But even in that case, that media got play on that video got play on major media outlets, and this is what I'm talking about in terms of the importance of really paying attention to the mass media and not just writing them off. Because let's be honest, like that connected with a lot of people who would not have seen it on an outlet like Pacifico or Indie Media because it got into the mass consciousness.
Well, they control what Joe Sixpack and Joe Camel are going to do at the polls.
Yeah, well,
They control
control comes in a lot of different varieties.
5-word sound bites and commercials and football games and stuff like that is half the rednecks in my county think I'm crazy,
Yeah.
and all I ever hear is 3 to 5-word sound bites
Absolutely.
of something that they've heard on a commercial. That's all they know. If
And
you
it's
take them
unfortunate.
further than that,
Yeah.
they don't talk about politics and religion.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And it's unfortunate, but the sort of thing that I hope some of you at least might take away is that we can play that game too. We know the theory, we know the background. This is a group full of leaders, of people who have worked out their position, and sure, you would like everybody to have that level of complexity to their thinking. People have busy lives. This is where the other potential, upside of sound bites, not necessarily an upside in the absolute, but in our society, in the conditions that we live in, people are very busy just surviving. And not all of them have the time to engage at the level that many of us would like to. And, it's a big, big debate, but
I think sometimes, and if somebody does video, I've found is it often has to do more with production value than the length of the video. So there's a lot in what I do. A lot of people all the time are saying, "Oh, you have to make it under 3 minutes." And the thing is that you do have to make it under 3 minutes if it's just going to be a video of somebody standing in front of a room with a PowerPoint or something.
Yeah.
You do have to make it short. But look at Coney 2012. It's the fastest growing video in the history of YouTube.
Yeah.
It's 27 minutes.
What's it
Yeah.
called?
Coney 2012. It's an absolutely horrific video,
Yeah.
but it's the production value is so good, and you know what I mean. It's horribly well funded. We can talk about 2012 for the
Yeah.
rest of the day, but that video. But it's the fastest growing video within a week. It was over 200 million or something like that.
And of course, it does also highlight some of the pitfalls of whether you're trying to engage with mass media or just spread a mass message, because of course, Coney 2012 ended up being a really kind of embarrassing bust. They did that, they attempted to turn it into a street movement, and it totally failed. And so another thing that we didn't really address here
Well,
is,
the leader kind of opted out.
well, there was that too.
Oh, really?
But the other thing that we didn't really address here is how do you, media is one part of a comprehensive strategy that includes much more grassroots activism, things like, canvassing and all this stuff. It has to happen at the same time. A media message that's 30 seconds can make somebody interested in your message, but it's not the core of your message or the entirety of it. And again, even a 30-minute video isn't necessarily going to turn somebody into an activist. Other comments on coverage?
You haven't mentioned the role of repetition. We talk about this. You hear a message
Thank
over
you.
and over again, and it sinks in better than if it's seen once.
Yeah.
And so, there's this need to make sure that your message gets out there more than just once, that there's a certain value to repetition, which is obviously the reason that they run the same damn television commercials
Yeah.
over and over and over again, because if you've seen it 100 times, you're more likely to believe it than if you've seen it once.
On that note, on the note of repetition, I think that to my mind, the most important thing that you've brought up so far is the idea of novelty. And I think that there is really no getting around the fact that something that's intellectually or emotionally sticky something that's mimetic, is going to go up the chain and it's going to proliferate. And something like, for instance, I mean, for the last week, legitimate rape has been relentless, and that has been repeated over and over. And I mean, it was, you know, the pairing of those words that really did it. I mean, there's the broader fact that this is a guy that may or may not believe in something like legitimate rape, but he believes in building a platform and policy around.
Yeah, that's a
who
good
knows
example of sort of an unintentionally catchy phrase, right? And again, it's two words: police brutality, violent anarchists, legitimate rape.
I think going off that kind of topic is the success that OWS had, Occupy Wall Street had with like 99%, you
Right.
know, like in Occupy Wall Street, not Occupy New York City, but Occupy Wall Street, things like that. And the novelty, I mean, when I discuss like Occupy Tampa with people, like they're like, wait, you sleep on a sidewalk? Like what? Like that did help a lot, or sleeping in a park or whatever.
Right, novelty and good choice
That was
of
something
words.
different, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, well, that part might not have helped, but so I hope this has been useful. Does anybody have questions or other topics they'd like to bring up?
No, please.
When you said at the beginning about how one thing to keep in mind about journalists too, is that you said at the beginning of $30,000 being the entry salary and things like that. It's certainly true, but I think it depends where you're talking about. But another thing to keep in mind though is that journalism is actually one of the least accessible positions based on social class in the world. You know, up there with lawyer and doctor.
Yeah.
Because you have years of unpaid work before you even get to that $30,000 thing. So you have to do interning and all these things like this, and people that don't have families that can't support them through that process after a 4-year university degree, after all these things, don't get there.
Yeah.
So despite the fact that somebody might only be making $35,000, they might come from a family, they might have a trust fund, they might
That's
have all
very
these
true.
other things. That, you know, it's a really unachievable profession for the majority of people.
Yeah, and the other part of that is that there's a sort of gatekeeping at the personnel level. I mean, it's inaccessible because of that requirement of unpaid whatever, but it's also inaccessible because you know, it's just a very sort of hegemonic institution that hires people. You only get hired as a journalist if you're already assumed to be representing an acceptable viewpoint. And so it is
Amen.
important.
Amen.
And so, I mean, it's very, there is diversity and there are people who represent a lot of different perspectives, but it's very much a reality that, it's people from conventional backgrounds, both, not even conventional, but like privileged backgrounds in many ways, and conventional mindsets. And so that's why, again, we go back to the common values of the mainstream, quote unquote, whatever you want to define that as.
One thing that you might want to consider if you want your story out there is because of the decline in print versions, a lot of people are getting their news on the websites of these organizations. Deadline issues change as a result because it's constantly being updated, but a lot of them have sections with participant stories where you can basically put your story in. It may get read and looked at, but you know, you can put your story in as you see fit, and it becomes part of a more established media as a result.
Yeah, and that's one that can really work for and against you, right? Because obviously, the more organized a group is, the more money it has potentially. I mean, some of those citizen stories might not really be coming from citizens at all. They might be coming from, you know, astroturfing organizations who are putting out people to do that for them. And so those of us with fewer resources, you know, have to figure out how to use those resources to the best of our ability as we try and counter that. Cool.
Well, but on the flip side, I think because of the quick 24-hour news cycle of mass media, a lot of stories get picked up and repackaged with really no vetting or editing.
Yeah.
From local sources, blogs, citizen reporting, local affiliates, and so I think that there's a lot to developing something, you know, hyperlocal news sources. I think that there's a lot to doing something, creating a culture of news journalism where you are, because that stuff does go against change.
Swim Chung.
So that brings up, you know, just one final point. I don't know if you can see the
Time travel.
Woo! Come on, hey, come in. You're really good at this, actually.
Ponies. Oh wait, let's get him in.
Yeah, here, come on, hang on. Wait, did you come here with him?
With Vermin?
Yeah.
No, we don't work together.
You seem to be wrapping up. Curious. No, not at all. We have a surprise guest.
Surprise!
Would you, rather than me, would you care to introduce yourself?
Well, my name is Vermin Supreme, and I'm a fairly well-known fringe candidate, and I've had a lot of luck just garnering media. I'm not sure why, but
Care to take a guess?
well, I would guess that my strategies of utilizing simple yet elegant solutions that seem to really attract the media. I mean, I think the fact that I'm known for wearing a rubber boot on my head, just that simple, very simple and yet elegant thing that is so different that it can't help but to have the media trip over themselves.
And we've really been talking about these things that get media attention, and so novelty clearly in your case is one that's working.
Clearly, and I've upped it to include to be referential to the media, because oftentimes they ask, what does the boot stand for? And when they ask, I say, the boot is shit and you are the fly. I think that's just true. That's just the fact of the matter. And
Absolutely.
yes, I think you know, pranks and stunts and carefully, you know, in my case, you know, just crafting I mean, it's not gibberish, but it's certainly not reality-based platforms or things I stand for. But by using the humor, it just really it's become very media friendly.
Yeah.
Whereas, you know, early on in my campaigning years, back in the early '90s, I was more of a media whore, where it's like I would come into a town and I would literally just knock on the door of the newspaper and start ranting about the media blackout and demanding coverage. And that's another way to like take it directly to them. And I did have success with that, but of course as the years went on and I became more of a fixture, now they just come at me.
I just want to say something. So you're saying like the part of your like stump speech and the things that you say, it's a lot of gibberish, right? That's how you even describe
Well, I
it.
say it's not gibberish.
Oh, it's not gibberish.
No, I mean it's fanciful. It's.
I was gonna say that the thing that ties the things that you say to reality, I feel or I see is like the structure of the sentences that you say. So like you take the same sentences said by political figures and then remove some words and insert others. So like you use or like you insert pony as opposed to some other good or service, right?
Yes, sure.
It
And
becomes kind of a critique of the political rhetoric itself.
Exactly. So okay, that's all.
Pony 2012.
But it was just it has a lot to do with I think like the structure of your phrasing.
Yes, I mean I think what I'm giving is maybe I hate to read too much shit into my shit, and I never want to present myself as a pundit or anything like that. But just the fact that it's sort of a media critique, and I think that because it's reflective of the media, maybe they like it or are more attracted to it, or just subconsciously rock onto it.
Yeah, and the other thing that I was hoping to turn a discussion about the way that protest as a concept has been covered, especially in the context of the RNC, and my observation was that it's sort of become routinized. Like the protesters are going to be here, how do we deal with them? What is the police presence going to be? It sort of has lost that sense of novelty, and so I think that I'm really excited that you're here because I think it's a great example of ways that we can reconceptualize protest and resistance, not necessarily away from mass manifestations because those are so important, but you know, we have these much more incisive, and I mean, I'm presuming you work with a very small team,
Yes.
and you're able to accomplish a lot.
Yes, I mean, really, I think what I've done is just found a very small niche, and I've been able to work it effectively.
Yeah.
You know, the running for president thing, you know, I mean, just by that, it's national in scope, and it achieves that national exposure and the national interest. And so I'm able to speak to a much larger audience than if I were running for a local office with a similar pretext or some such.
Yeah.
And yeah, this year just got a lot of things came together. You know, I've been doing my thing for 25 years, but this time with the you know, the crappy race that was lined up, and just the social media and the transition of the print media to the digital media, and you know, just me having my thing together, and just the fluke of Randall Terry running as a Democrat and alphabetically being one person away from me, and so there's just a lot of things that really came together. But when it hit, it did hit big, and I was definitely not ready for that sort of weird meme thing, but it has come back at me in love. And for me, the personal experience is just lots of love. I mean, I went to the Ron Paul Festival yesterday, and they just loved me so much. And you know, people that I disagree with politically on a lot of levels, but because my message seemed to be universal or non-threatening, or it was critiquing, not people didn't take it personally. They didn't feel like I was attacking them, but I was attacking more of the structure. And you know, I ended up with like 10,000 subscribers on Facebook, and I know that half are left and half are right. It's just become a more interesting place.
Yeah.
That page.
And I would also emphasize that